Great Rulers of Ancient Rome by Hugh Griffith, read by Benjamin Soames. Of all the people who lived a long time ago, the ones we owe most to for all sorts of reasons are the old Greeks and the old Romans. Of these, the general view is that the Greeks were terribly bright, but the Romans were rather dim. The Greeks had brains that were spilling over with ideas about this and that, about the stars and the planets, about numbers and geometry, about the gods, about music, poetry, and philosophy. This was all happening about 2,500 years ago. They even invented democracy, which is a marvellous achievement. The Romans came along a little later, although still more than 2,000 years ago, and they were very different. They did have brains, or so it's believed, but they didn't use them a great deal for thinking clever thoughts the way the Greeks did. On the other hand, they were amazingly good at building walls and arches and domes and roads, which are a lot more difficult than you might think if you don't have a mechanical digger, supplying water for the city, making laws, collecting taxes, and generally doing the things that made life better for everyone. The clever Greeks, on the other hand, had such a lovely time arguing with each other that they didn't bother too much about getting things to run smoothly or settling down to live peacefully together. Of course, the Romans themselves weren't exactly peaceful. When we say they were very good at doing the things that made life better for everyone, that doesn't include the people they happened to be putting to death at the time. The Romans liked watching gladiators kill each other, animals tearing criminals to pieces, and Christians being put to death. If there were no humans available for killing at the time, they would happily watch one lot of animals ripping the throats out of another lot of animals. In short, they loved the sight of blood, and much more so than the Greeks, who, that said, were not always the soul of kindness. Given how cruel the Romans could be when they were in the mood, being under their rule actually wasn't at all bad. This was because they really did like things to work, and they found that what worked best when ruling people was to leave them alone to get on with their lives in their own way, even making their own laws if they felt like it. And this was mostly how it was in all the lands under the Roman rule, which they called their empire. Peace and prosperity for all. Of course, the Romans had the armies and could beat the hell out of anyone if they chose, but mostly they didn't choose. And life inside the Roman Empire was mostly a lot less grim than it was outside. Maybe the Romans weren't quite as dim as we thought. Now, about that empire. When we hear of an empire, we think of something enormous covering huge areas of the Earth's surface. Not so long ago, there was a British Empire, and the proud boast was that the sun never set over it. In other words, the empire was so large that there was always some part where it was daytime, whether Australia or India or Canada or wherever. This was bigger than the Roman Empire had ever been. But in its full form, the British Empire didn't last long. In fact, hardly more than about 50 years. The Romans had theirs for a lot longer, nearly 500 years in fact, and even then it survived in some fashion for at least another 500 years after that. As for how big it was, the Roman Empire included Italy, of course, as well as what we now call France, Spain, parts of Germany and Britain, Greece, North Africa, Egypt, the Middle East, Turkey, and all the lands around the Black Sea. But it didn't need to be this big to count as an empire. Our word, empire, comes from the Latin word imperium, and this just means rule. So for the Romans, their empire was simply that part of the world which they ruled. In the beginning, it was quite a small part. And remember that these were Romans, not Italians. It was the single city of Rome that ruled the others. Italy was then only a name for an area of land, not a country in our modern sense.